Every week I see the same fear being sold to retirees in slightly different clothing. Convert to Roth now. Act before taxes explode. Move the money while you still can. Do it today or regret it later. The tone changes a little, the graphics change, the presenter changes, but the underlying emotional hook is almost always the same. If you do not convert now, the government is waiting to punish you later. That story is powerful because it sounds plausible. It also sounds responsible, and that is exactly why it spreads so easily. Most bad financial advice does not sound reckless. It sounds prudent, it sounds urgent, it sounds as if some hidden danger has finally been revealed to the wise. That is what makes this Roth conversion mania so effective. It feels like secret knowledge. It feels like a sophisticated move. It feels like the kind of thing serious people do while everyone else sleeps. And because it feels that way, millions of retirees are hearing advice that does not belong to them. That is the mother line of this whole story. Roth conversions are not a universal solution. They are a strategic tool that only works well in a narrow set of circumstances, and most of the people being pushed toward them are nowhere near those circumstances. That is the truth. Not that Roth conversions are bad, not that they never work, not that nobody should ever do one. They can be excellent in the right situation. What bothers me is the way they are being sold as though they are automatically wise for almost everybody. That is nonsense. And nonsense gets expensive when taxes are involved. So I want to walk you through this the same way the source does, because the source lays out the structure correctly. First, why the advice became so widespread. Second, who actually benefits and who usually does not. Third, the 6 mistakes that destroy whatever benefit might have existed. Fourth, the very specific situations where conversions can actually make sense. And finally, the uncomfortable part, most people are not being told who benefits from giving this advice so aggressively in the first place. Let us begin with the fear itself. There is a fear moving through retirement circles that if you do not act now, taxes in retirement are going to become a kind of slow ambush. You stop working, you think you are safe, then required distributions arrive, tax rates rise, Social Security becomes more taxable, Medicare premiums rise, and suddenly the government is taking more of your retirement than you expected. That fear is driving real behavior. People are converting at a pace that feels urgent, almost panicked. But the source is very clear on the important distinction. The problem is not the Roth conversion as a financial tool. The problem is the way the tool is being presented. It is being marketed like a catch. All solution when in reality it only serves a very small slice of retirees well. And once you understand who that slice actually is, the whole conversation changes. Fay Filicite, Fay Turn, 53 File 0 Fay. That is why I like the Source S framework so much. It uses a 3-tier wealth analysis. Simple, practical, not mystical. Because once you organize retirees by actual asset level, you stop pretending everybody sits in the same tax universe. That is one of the biggest failures in retirement advice. People act as if everyone is just a generic retiree, some vague character moving through the same tax maze. Number, a household with $200,000 does not have the same problem as a household with $2 million. A household with $2 million does not have the same problem as one with $12 million. And if the problem is not the same, the strategy should not be the same either. So let us go tier by tier. Tier 1 is under $500,000 in assets. This is the group that matters most because it contains a huge share of ordinary Americans. And according to the source, Roth conversions are rarely useful here in any meaningful way. That should already calm a lot of people down. If you are in this group, the default answer is usually no, not because nobody under $500,000 should ever convert, because the numbers rarely justify it. The source does leave one narrow exception. If you are in this lower asset group, but you have unusually high guaranteed income, things like Social Security combined with one or multiple pensions, then the math might shift enough to justify at least modeling a conversion. That is the test, not general fear, not vibes. A very direct question. Do you expect your guaranteed income in retirement to exceed your pre-retirement income? If yes, then perhaps there is something worth modeling. If no, then according to the source, conversions will likely be a net negative over your retirement lifespan. And the source says this single test eliminates Roth conversion consideration for roughly 90% of people in this wealth tier. 90%, that is a huge filter. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn-53, File 0 Fay, that matters because it tells you how distorted the public conversation has become. If 9 out of 10 people in the biggest wealth group can mostly stop worrying once they ask one plain question, then why are they being fed so much anxiety? Because anxiety sells. That is why. Now let us move to Tier 2. This is where most of the bad advice lives. The source defines it as roughly $500,000 to $5 million in assets. And I think that is exactly where the real confusion takes hold. People in this range are wealthy enough to be scared by future tax scenarios, but not necessarily wealthy enough to benefit from doing sophisticated things badly. That is a very dangerous middle ground. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn-53, File 0 Fay, the source, says this group may benefit from conversions, but only under very specific conditions. And I want to emphasize the phrase very specific because too many people here may benefit and mentally translate it into probably should do it. Number here, the needle becomes narrow. Condition number 1, according to the source, is that you have a gap period in retirement. A real one, a period after you stop working. But before Social Security or pensions begin, and during that gap you can live comfortably using after-tax non-retirement money without reducing your quality of life. That is not a small condition. That is a very big ask. It requires liquid resources. It requires timing. It requires optionality. It requires not being financially squeezed the moment work stops. A lot of households do not have that. They have a retirement transition, yes, but not one with enough independent cash to calmly pay conversion taxes while leaving retirement balances intact. That is the first gate. Condition number 2 is that you can pay the tax bill from after-tax money. This is where many Roth conversion fantasies go to die. Because if you need to use retirement funds themselves to pay the taxes on the conversion, then the math begins weakening immediately. The source is explicit on this. Most people cannot do the ideal version and will need some degree of retirement funds to cover the conversion tax in the year they move the money. Once that happens, the purity of the strategy gets damaged. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn-53, File 0 Fay, and this is one of the themes that runs through the whole source. The ideal version of Roth conversion math often exists in a laboratory. In the laboratory, you have a low tax year, lots of outside cash, clean bracket space, plenty of time to let the new Roth balance grow tax-free, and no painful tax interactions being triggered elsewhere. Fine. In real life, the laboratory is crowded, real life has cash constraints, real life has uneven income, real life has timing issues, real life has competing priorities, real life has people who need the money for living expenses, not just tax optimization. That is why advice that sounds so elegant in principle becomes dangerous in practice. Now, the source gives a third condition for this middle tier. You are preparing for very specific future tax disadvantages, not imaginary ones, specific ones. The widow or widower penalty when filing status changes from married filing jointly to single Medicare or MA surcharges after required distributions begin. Other foreseeable structural tax problems that actually show up in the math that matters, because the source is not saying maybe taxes will be scary someday. It is saying, are you preparing for a concrete problem that has an actual mechanism? That is a much higher standard. Fay-Felicite, Fay-Turn-53, File 0 Fay, and this is where I think many retirees get led badly astray. They are told to act on abstract fear. The source is telling you to act only on modeled disadvantage. That is how adults should think. Not what if taxes rise generally, but what specific disadvantage do I actually face? And how do the numbers look if I respond to that exact thing? That is a much better question. Now we move to Tier 3. Over $5 million. This is where the source says conversions actually start making much more sense. I think that is exactly right. And it also explains a great deal about why the public messaging around Roth conversions feels so distorted. A lot of the loudest advice in finance is built around upper-tier problems and then irresponsibly translated downward to everyone else. People with over $5 million in assets are in a different world. The source says they are often already in the highest tax brackets because of the income their asset base throws off. They face large required distributions. They can usually afford to pay conversion taxes. They can absorb higher withdrawals. They may also care deeply about estate planning and tax management for heirs. In other words, their problem is not mainly, can I afford this? Their problem is much more often, how do I minimize taxes across a very large and durable asset base? Faithfully cite Fayturn 53 File 0 Fay. That is a real problem, but it is not the same problem as the ordinary retiree. Money is no longer the binding constraint taxes are. That is why the strategy changes. And once you step back and look across all three tiers, the source gives the statistic that really should reset the entire conversation. Only about 2% of retirees actually meet the conditions where Roth conversions provide meaningful long-term lifetime benefit. 2%. That means 98% of retirees are being handed advice that either does not apply or only barely applies under conditions they probably do not meet. Faithfully cite Fayturn 53, File 0 Fay. That is a staggering mismatch. It should make you deeply skeptical anytime someone says everybody should be doing Roth conversions right now. Everybody should not. Almost nobody should by default. That is the real conclusion. Now, before we go further, I want to address the fear foundation because the source does that next, and it is one of the most important sections. A huge share of Roth conversion marketing is built on one assumption. Taxes are definitely about to get much worse. You hear it constantly. Convert now or rates will explode. Move now before the window closes. Do it while rates are still low. That message has become so common that many retirees now take it as settled fact, but the source is right to challenge it. First, the source notes public opinion data from Pew showing that most Americans already feel they pay more than their fair share, while supporting higher taxes on corporations and wealthy individuals rather than on themselves. That matters because tax politics is not abstract. It moves through public tolerance. Faithfully cite Fayturn 53 File 0 Fay 2nd. The source says the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act framework has changed the old fear story materially. The old automatic expiration narrative has weakened. Lower rate assumptions now look more stable than fear marketers often imply. And even if tax rates do rise in the future, the source argues those increases are more likely to hit the highest earners at the top marginal ranges than most retirees sitting in ordinary brackets. That means the broad panic about future tax catastrophe is built on shakier ground than the rhetoric suggests. Faithfully cite Fayturn 53 File 0 Fay. That matters tremendously because if the central fear engine driving conversions is based on outdated or exaggerated assumptions, then the urgency begins collapsing right there. Now let us go to the 6 costly mistakes because this is where even potentially good Roth conversions get destroyed. Mistake number 1 is incomplete tax analysis. This is the kind of error that should embarrass professionals. Yet it happens constantly. The source says many people make conversion decisions without understanding the full tax picture, including dividends, interest, taxable account flows, and other investment income. That means the conversion is being modeled in partial view. And when you make tax moves using only part of the picture, you can easily create taxes elsewhere that you did not intend. Faithfully cite Fayturn 53 File 0 Fay. This is why I hate one variable advice. Taxes are interactive. Retirement taxes are especially interactive. You do not get to move one lever and assume the rest of the machine stays still. If a Roth conversion pushes another income source into taxable treatment that would otherwise have stayed sheltered, then the conversion math has changed. That is the whole point. Mistake. Number 2 is short-term tax focus. The source describes this as optimizing the current year's bill without analyzing the lifetime tax burden. That is penny-wise and pound-foolish. And I think that is exactly the right phrase. Faithfully cite Fayturn 53 File 0 Fay. Too many people get hypnotized by the present year tax hit or the present year tax savings without asking the larger question. Across the whole retirement, across withdrawals, across filing status changes, across required distributions, across longevity. Does this actually improve the total outcome? That is the only question that matters, not whether the conversion looks smart in a single isolated year. Mistake number 3 is ignoring tax interactions. This is the big one. The source lists them clearly. Conversions can trigger taxes on Social Security benefits. They can push capital gains from 0% treatment to 15%. They can trigger Medicare or MA surcharges. They can eliminate Affordable Care Act subsidy support. Those interactions can wipe out much of the benefit. And the source is right that this has to be modeled very specifically on a year-by-year basis. You cannot just wave your hands and say the Roth is tax-free later, so everything must be good. Fay file cite Fay turn 53 file 0 Fay, that is lazy planning. What matters is not only the direct tax on the conversion, what matters is what the conversion drags behind it. Some of the most expensive financial decisions are expensive because of the second-order effects, not the first-order headline. Mistake number 4 is the early distribution penalty. This one matters because it catches people who are under 59.5 and use withholding from the conversion amount itself to pay the tax. The source points out that this withholding can count as an early distribution subject to a 10% penalty. That is a hidden cost, and it can blow up the math much faster than people realize. Fay file cite Fay turn 53 file 0 Fay again. That ties right back to the source. S earlier point, having outside cash matters. If you do not have outside money to pay the tax, you are often not the ideal candidate. Mistake number 5 is poor post-conversion investment strategy. This one gets ignored because people are so busy debating whether to convert that they forget the money still has to be invested intelligently afterward. The source says some retirees then invest converted Roth funds too conservatively or fail to optimize account-specific asset placement, which reduces the very tax-free growth advantage the conversion was supposed to create. Meanwhile, they may leave traditional accounts holding the wrong things and increase future taxable distributions unnecessarily. Fay file cite Fay turn 53 file 0 Fay. That is such an important point. A Roth conversion is not a standalone magic trick. It is part of a larger system. If the asset placement after the conversion is sloppy, the tool gets dulled. Mistake number 6 is converting when inappropriate. This may be the most common mistake of all, and the source gives the perfect example. If you have $100,000 in traditional retirement accounts, your required distributions in your mid-70s may only be around $4,000 a year initially. So why pay 22% now to avoid future withdrawals that may only be taxed at 10% or 12%? That is not good planning. That is paying more to save less. Fay file cite Fay turn 53 file 0 Fay. That is exactly the kind of arithmetic error fear-based marketing produces. People hear future taxes and start treating all pre-tax money like a house on fire. But a small traditional balance is not necessarily a tax disaster. Sometimes it is barely a tax issue at all. That is what the source means when it says long-term planning matters more than generalized fear. Now let us go to the part many viewers will not expect. When do Roth conversions actually make sense? The source answers this. Well, not for everyone, not even for most retirees. But they can be powerful in narrow conditions. The source even says the ideal candidate may look less like someone in their 60s and more like someone in their 30s or 40s with decades of tax-free growth ahead, especially if that person is currently in a low bracket, has substantial cash reserves, and genuinely expects higher personal tax rates later. That is an entirely different profile from the retiree panic being marketed every day. Fay file cite Fay turn 53 file 0 Fay. Now within retirement itself, the source points to a few strategic opportunities that are real income. Gap periods between retirement and Social Security. Systematically filling the lowest tax brackets like 10 to 12% over multiple years. And households with genuinely large tax deferred balances that will create burdensome required distributions. Notice how specific those are, not convert because taxes are scary. Convert if your exact timing, bracket space, cash reserve, and future distribution profile line up in a way that the math actually supports. That is a much higher bar. and that is why so few people truly qualify. Now, I want to turn to the part that may explain why the bad advice is so loud. Who benefits from all of this pressure? The source does not dance around it. Roth conversion recommendations can be very effective business tools for advisors. They address fear. They sound sophisticated. They create urgency. They also generate fees when advisors manage the conversion strategy itself, or continue managing the converted assets. In other words, the recommendation is not only a planning recommendation, it can also be a revenue recommendation for the person giving it. Fay file a site Fay turn 53 file 0 Fay that should not make you cynical. It should make you alert the source. Even gives warning signs. Blanket convert now advice without analysis. Fear-based urgency about tax rates. Recommendations that ignore your actual cash flow advice, that never ask which wealth tier you are in. That is not objective planning. That is sales. And I think the source is exactly right to say that if you smell those signals, you are probably being sold something rather than guided thoughtfully. Fay file a site Fay turn 53 file 0 Fay. Now let us finish with the source S step by step guide, because I think it is the right way to close. Step 1, identify your wealth tier honestly. Under $500,000, $500,000 to $5 million, over $5 million. Not where you hope to be, where you are. That honesty alone eliminates enormous amounts of confusion. Step 2, review the actual criteria for your tier, not generic criteria, your tier S criteria. This is where most people discover they were never close to the ideal Roth conversion case in the first place. Step 3, if you do meet the criteria, all the full conversion math, including all tax interactions, not just ordinary bracket math, all of it, Social Security, capital gains, IRMASA, AKA subsidies, everything. Step 4, calculate the break, even point, and determine whether you will live long enough and have a stable enough horizon to get there. That is not a morbid question. It is a practical one, a strategy with a long break. Even period is not a gift to someone who may never realize its benefits. Step 5, confirm you have enough after-tax money outside retirement accounts to pay the conversion taxes properly. If the answer is no, the source says we should think more than twice before moving ahead. I agree. Fay Felicite Fay turn 53 file 0 Fay, that is the full structure. And once you see the structure, the Roth conversion hype starts looking much less like wisdom and much more like what it usually is. Advice aimed at a tiny minority being marketed to the broad public because fear is profitable. That is why I wanted to rewrite this one carefully. Because the lesson here is larger than Roth conversions. The larger lesson is this: the loudest financial advice is often the least personalized. And the least personalized advice is often the most dangerous, because it flatters you into believing that a tool designed for someone else must surely apply to you too. It often does not. Logic should drive these decisions, not fear, not trends, not advisor urgency, not tax horror stories meant for somebody 3 wealth tiers above you. Real planning is personal. Real planning is specific. Real planning begins with your actual balance sheet, your actual tax exposure, your actual time horizon, your actual cash reserves, and your actual goals. That is why there are no universal solutions in retirement. There are only tools, timelines, and trade-offs, and Roth conversions belong exactly where the source puts them, in the toolbox. Not on a pedestal, not as a default, not as a fear response. A tool, useful sometimes, wrong often, and very expensive when misused. So if you take one thing from me today, let it be this. Before you convert because someone scared you, ask which wealth tier you are really in. Ask whether you can pay the tax outside the account. Ask what future problem you are actually solving, and ask whether the full lifetime math still works after every ugly interaction gets included. That is how adults make decisions, not by reacting to headlines, by forcing the numbers to tell the truth. And once you do that, I suspect most of you will discover what the source discovered first, that the great Roth conversion panic was never really about your retirement at all. It was about selling a sophisticated story to people who were scared enough to believe it.